Welcome to Strip Cover Lit, where we squeeze the bigger picture out of literature. I'm Adrian Fort, and we are here for the 8th in a 15-part series as we journey room by room through the Overlook Hotel in the pages of The Shining by Stephen King. This video is over chapters 26 through 29, and what happened in these chapters. These chapters went as such. 26 is titled Dreamland. Jack and Wendy have both fallen asleep. Jack has a dream/nightmare about his father and his relationship with his father. And in this, dear old dad says, you've got to kill them. Your wife and your son both. So, doing the only thing that seemed relatively on point, Jack went ahead and broke the CB radio. Chapter 27 is called Catatonic. Wendy sprints into the room after hearing Jack screaming and breaking the CB radio and asks him, what's wrong? Oh, just a nightmare. Hey, where's Danny? Calamity ensues until they find Danny at the top of the stairs with a catatonic expression. The chapter's titled Catatonic. I don't remember if I said that or not. But he was standing there in a catatonic state with marks around his neck. Jack is blamed for this because Jack Nicholson played him in the movie, and of course that makes sense at this point, right? Wendy flees to their room after Jack gets angry and violent-ish. Chapter 28 is titled It Was Her. Jack has imaginary drinks with a ghost bartender. You always were my favorite, Lloyd. Until Wendy bites the bullet and takes Danny back to Jack out of fear for Danny's health and safety. During this meeting, Danny comes out of his catatonic state, out of his trance, and utters the phrase, it was her. Jack temporarily pounces upon this, but he's very smug because in the narration we understand that Jack has no illusions, and never has, that it was Wendy who did this. But he is still willing to let her take a bit of blame, or at least to feel that fear of what it's like to be accused of something like this. Chapter 29 is titled Kitchen Talk, and herein, Jack makes Danny a stiff drink. And, presumably drunk, Danny comes clean about The Shining, about his talk with Halloran, and about all of the apparitions that he has already seen. Jack leaves to inspect room 217, first off, to the chagrin of Wendy. Wendy says, you shouldn't be leaving us, which is questionable at this point, because there seems to be an intruder in the hotel. There are physical marks around Danny's neck. Someone else is there. What is the correct protocol in this circumstance? It's hard to say, but one would imagine that you take the most violent of the bunch and you want to send them against that other person. Jack takes the moment to poke at Wendy and says, you're doing a great impression of your mother, which, of course, pisses Wendy off. But that is where we leave the Overlook in these chapters. And I think that it is definitely something worth playing into here. We talked a little bit last time about the deets, and what those are, and what those mean, and what's going on, and the fact that Wendy is the only one here that does not questionably have some of the bad Shining. Halloran says that he thinks all mothers have some touch of the Shining. Okay, but there seems to be a good side and a bad side to the Shining. Danny even intuits as much when he says that it used to be better with Tony, but sometimes it's really not all that great. So if there is a light side and a dark side to The Shining, we have made a little bit of connection in discussion between the deets boy, I can't remember what that stands for. Delirium tremens. And what that might be on a metaphorical level with The Shining. And I think it's very interesting that at this moment where we start this, when we start these chapters of the reading, we have just had exposure to the term deets, and we're in a weird place as far as what that means. But we open chapter 26 with this. Knitting made her sleepy. Today, even bar talk would have made her sleepy, and it wasn't bar talk on the little phonograph, it was Bach. Her hands grew slower and slower. And at the same time her son was making an acquaintance of room 217's long-term residence, Wendy was asleep with her knitting on her lap. The yarn and needles rose in the slow time of her breathing. Her sleep was deep, and she did not dream. Her sleep was deep, and she did not dream. What are the deets? The deets are you not getting into that deep sleep. The deets are suffered by alcoholics and people kicking the habit, both one and the same, it seems, because we are not getting to that place where we do dream. So here she is having one symptom of deep sleep, which is not dreaming, but she is getting the comfort from sleep, the other essential element of sleep. Anyone who has gone through or suffers with long-term light sleep understands that even 5 minutes of that deep, deep sleep really goes a long way. So here she is getting that deep sleep. Now, symbolically, what is Danny? Danny is he is the coming together of Jack and Wendy. Jack certainly suffers from the alcoholism, certainly suffers with the deets, and we're being led more and more to believe, I think, that Jack has some element of actual shining about him. So Danny. So the very next paragraph here. Jack Torrance had fallen asleep too, but his sleep was light and uneasy, populated by dreams that seemed too vivid to be mere dreams. They were certainly more vivid than any dreams he had had before. So it's strange that Jack is having the suffering part of deep sleep with having the added element of the dreams, which are the part that if your brain doesn't get, it will take, which is on some level, maybe metaphorically, what's going on with The Shining in general. While this is happening, Danny is full throttle into delirious, as far as the story is concerned, they are not delirious visions. But if we're looking at this metaphorically, and we're looking at the metaphorical substrate, if you will, of this novel, Danny is full throttle into the actual negative deets effects. He's having delirious symptoms. He's having physical agitation to these things that he's seeing. So it's interesting that what's going on there is Danny, if you take a step back, Danny is sort of a projection of the things which are troubling the both of them at that moment. But he is absent from either of them. That was on 325. I don't know if I said that. On 327, while Jack is dreaming about his father, we get an interesting little nugget. There are mild spoilers here for Dr. Sleep, but nothing serious. I think what I'm about to, well, maybe skip ahead a few minutes if you have not read Dr. Sleep and do not want anything spoiled for you, but it needs to be said, I've not finished Dr. Sleep. I got, I think, 200 and some odd pages in and did not finish that novel. So anything that I'm about to spoil can't really be all that spoilerific. During Jack's dream about his father, we're given this about Jack's father. He had been a male nurse at the Berlin Community Hospital. He was also a drunk. But this is interesting because, well, we'll go the opposite way. We'll go with the drunk part first. Grandpa was a drunk. Jack's a drunk. Danny grows into a drunk. Surprise. So they all have that in common. What else might they have in common? What are we being led chapter by chapter more into the belief of? We're led to believe more and more that Jack has some form of the shining, some bit of the shining. There is something weird going on in Jack's head. And we're led to believe, I think, even from the moment that Halloran mentions the fact that something's going on in your daddy's head, but I can't tell what. That this is not just him suffering with alcoholism. Surely, as long as Halloran has lived, he's seen that struggle before. So maybe Jack has the shining, but we also know, if we've read any part of Dr. Sleep, Danny grows up and he works in healthcare. And he works in healthcare for a very specific reason. I'm not going to ruin that reason, but I think you can sort of put together enough pieces, if you haven't read that, to understand that it is something to do with the shining that leads him into that work. Did Grandpa work at a hospital for the very same reason? Was Grandpa driven to the drink for the very same reason that Danny was later in life? Not just hereditary alcoholism, or presumably, obviously these are fictional characters, but was it the same thing that drove Danny to drink that got to Grandpa? And it is interesting that Jack inherited his father's drink, his father's violent temperament, perhaps his father's shine. But the healthcare work skips a generation. And I don't think we have any reason to believe, I'm trying to remember going forward in the novel, I don't think we have any reason to believe that Danny would know that his grandfather worked in healthcare. I don't remember this ever popping up in Dr. Sleep. Perhaps Wendy told him at some point, but I don't think the conversation happens at any point in this book between Jack and his son. Maybe it happened previously, but I mean, maybe any conversation has happened previously. So it is interesting in that case that oftentimes people fall into the same type of work that their father did, their grandfather did. It's not hereditary, but it's something that, you know, my dad worked at the Ford plant, so I work at the Ford plant. I'll introduce my son to it when it comes time. If nothing else, I'll put in a good word for him, you know, something like that. What might it be in that case if it was the shine which led to Grandpa being a nurse? What was it that led Jack away? Why is it that in this case, it is Jack that is the oddball? Being a teacher. Not, I mean, very different from being a nurse, but still a profession which lends itself to charitable individuals. So I don't know, it's just something worth thinking about, I think. The very next page, this is neither here nor there, really, with this, but it's just something that I think is worth pointing out. 328, we get this little passage. His father would sweep him up into his arms, and Jackie would be propelled deliriously upward. So fast it seemed he could feel air pressure settling against his skull like a cap made out of lead, up and up, both of them crying, "Elevator, elevator." And there had been nights when his father, in his drunkenness, had not stopped at the upward lift of his slab muscled arms soon enough, and Jack had gone right over his father's flat-topped head like a human projectile to crash onto the floor behind his dad. I wish I had prepared for this. I forgot that I took this note, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to, I don't know if it's in here. There is a poem. How are these? What? There is a poem called My Papa's Waltz by Theodore Rothke. And it is about a father-son relationship that is sort of questionably abusive. In the poem, it is the son talking about how much he loves his father and painting this picture of his father and their relationship. And all the while, God, I don't know if it's in here either. I'm an idiot. I should have had this figured out. But all the while, his father is dancing with him, or is he? His father might be abusing him. So that's not in here either. The poem is written, that Eminem song "Darkness" that's caused a lot of mayhem, because every line in it has a charitable reading and an uncharitable reading. This poem is very much in the same line. I don't know where the hell I have that poem. I've got it somewhere. But anyway, the poem is either about a father who loves his son, but is maybe just a bit rough. Maybe he's just one of those rough guys. Or his father's outright abusive, and his son neglects to memorialize his father in that light. So it's just interesting to see it thrown into a story like this, which is very much the relationship between Jack and his father and between Danny and Jack. Both of those relationships really sort of run that fine line. My series, Alone with Bukowski, if you can't, I'm sure you can find that poem on the internet if you just Google it. But I do have a video, I think in my series Alone with Bukowski, that I talk a little bit about that poem as well. But yeah, I just thought it was worth throwing out there. One small note, because we are in the horror genre, on page 337. This is during the sort of spat between Jack and Wendy. "Wendy?" he asked uncertainly. "Wendy?" The bewilderment seemed to grow, and for a moment she saw his true face, the one he ordinarily kept so well hidden, and it was a face of desperate unhappiness. The face of an animal caught in a snare beyond his ability to decipher and render harmless. Then the muscles began to work, began to writhe under the skin. The mouth began to tremble infirmly. The Adam's apple began to rise and fall. This passage sounds very much like a werewolf novel, even down to the very fact that we're leading into his look with the term bewilderment. I think that is, we have lost a little bit of that preceding of scenes with creepy terms, right? We've lost a little bit of that. But we do still have times where Stephen King is describing his characters, especially Jack, in these ways that are not favorable. And not just ways that aren't favorable. This passage seems to morph Jack into a monster. And not just any monster. It seems think back to every werewolf transformation you've seen in any movie in your entire life. And tell me this does not... the muscles began to work, began to writhe under the skin. The mouth began to tremble infirmly. The Adam's apple began to rise and fall. Tell me that doesn't sound like it. And what you're leading into it with is he looks like an animal caught in a snare beyond its ability to decipher and render harmless. So this is obviously not a criticism of the book, and it's not anything thematically that's necessarily worth talking about. But I said I did want to talk a little bit more about the sort of writer's edge to something like Stephen King, because I think anyone who... I don't know how I want to say this. I think anyone who values the storytelling aspect of writing as opposed to simply the academic aspects of literature, anyone who appreciates the storytelling aspect of writing has to appreciate Stephen King at some level. So when approaching this story as a writer, it does make me wonder a little bit, not necessarily about Stephen King's process, but you read a passage like that, and you're instantly put at his typewriter. Does that make sense? You're instantly put, like you're looking over his shoulder while he's writing, thinking, that works. Certainly it works. It's a great passage. I wonder how he got there. I wonder how he picked the image of a werewolf. Werewolves are very underutilized, very underrated in the horror pantheon. But how do you pick that for Jack? I think that obviously what's going on there is he's trying to trigger the same mechanism that makes you afraid of werewolves, because they're large and powerful and they're just beasts, right? They're not thinking, they're hunting. They don't want to kill, they want to eat. I think that a lot of that is going on there, and you're trapping those individuals, Danny and Wendy, in a hotel, snowbound, with a werewolf. And it's just interesting to me to go with that imagery, knowing that going forward, and this isn't a spoiler, not a real spoiler, but going forward, a lot of the imagery that you'll see is very cartoonish, is strangely cartoonish. And so to have this little... this moment here is to horror almost as Batman Begins is to the comic book genre, if that makes any sense to anyone except for me. The comic book genre is large and bright and visually verbose. Batman Begins was very grounded and was a guy figuring out, I'm kind of crazy. I think I'll try to use it to hurt people. The bad people. Werewolves and the horror genre as sort of... the werewolf part of the horror genre is very fantasy, is very magic and voodoo, is very this and that, is very ethereal. This is a guy who just looks like a wolf when he's angry. So it's just one of those passages that's very interesting to me as a reader, as a writer, as someone who's breaking down the novel. Maybe it's not interesting to anyone else, though. The last point I have to talk about is sort of something that is worth watching going forward. I had not noticed this previously when reading the novel. That dream to which Jack had succumbed, that turned him angry, that turned him violent, that made him break the CB radio. When did that spat of sleepiness hit him? He noticed something was wrong. What did he almost notice was wrong? He almost noticed that the key to room 217 was missing. This is something Danny and Wendy almost decided not to go back to the hotel, but they did, to discuss it with Jack. But turns out it was snowing, and there's no more decision left to make. There's a couple times in here so far that this has happened where just in the nick of time, something goes just wrong enough that now we have negative consequences. The thing that went wrong wasn't bad. Almost realizing that the keys to room 217 were missing. It's not a bad thing, but it led to something bad. Going back to the hotel to discuss with Jack, maybe we don't want to stay here all winter. It's not a bad thing. It's better than just up and leaving Jack. But it led to a bad thing. And this is sort of, there's something I talk about a lot, and it is sort of the pre-internet and post-internet modes of storytelling. A lot of pre-internet mode of storytelling, into which Stephen King obviously mostly fall. Actually, I don't know numbers-wise, but a lot of his bigger, better stories fall into that pre-internet mode of storytelling. Whenever you're telling a real-life horror story or a tragedy, he almost didn't get on that plane. Several things popped up. Several things went just right. And he ended up catching the flight that ended up going down. All sorts of mythos is and I can't think of anything off the top of my head. This is a bad video for that. I've got a terrible headache. Horrible headache. Ask your parents about the JFK assassination, about the Manson killing, about this or that. The lore that rises from these stories as they are told naturally is one of almosts and just ifs. But that is all I have for this episode. I hope to see you back next time for episode 8 as we journey through, episode 9, as we journey through the Overlook Hotel, which will be over chapters 30 through 33, pages 368 through 417.